How many of you have been to some of our other presentations? Maybe a handful of you? All right. So we are really, really excited about this conference. I cannot tell you how excited I am about this conference. In 2010, I went to Bruce Payne at Education Week, and I said, you don't have any classes on divorce. And he said, we don't have anybody to teach them. And I said, here I am. Like, I wanted to start sharing, because in the church I was divorced, and I didn't have a voice, and nobody was teaching me, and I didn't know how to deal with some of the things that we're talking about at this conference this week. So I'm really, really excited about this. My name is Margaret Pickard. I'm a family court judge in Las Vegas. This is my husband, Keith. He is a principal of the Nevada Family Law Group. And he's actually rewritten all of the family law legislation for child custody in Nevada. So we are very invested in this topic because we believe that you, as the parents of these kiddos that are going to be facing the future, are the key to the difference of how they will face their future and how they will react. So we had a debate over what to call this because Keith thought it would be really great to say, please tell me I'm not destroying my kids. And I said, why don't we say just, please tell me my kids will be okay? And he goes, that's not as good. And so there's a lot of truth to that. So
well, isn't it true that this is how we think of it?
Okay, he wins. He wins. All right, so what we decided today was that we were going to spend some time kind of telling our story. First and foremost, I just think it's so important that you understand President Nelson says, my dear brothers, I testify, this is from the evening sessions for the brethren, my dear brothers, I testify that he has been and is indeed leading us along as we seek to hear him. He wants us to grow and to learn, even though perhaps especially through adversity. So we're going to start at the beginning with our story because this is real talk. They asked us to be raw and tell you our story. So this is me in 2003 with my 4 kids. They were little, and this was the year that it was a hard year for me. So in 2002, my husband had told me that he wanted a divorce, and it was very shocking to me. And I know people can say, no, I didn't see it coming out. It came out of left field, but it did. Like, I know that in retrospect we had issues, but still I was not prepared for it. And so he said he wanted a divorce, and I just really didn't know what to do. And I felt worthless. I felt hurt. I felt replaced by a younger version, and I just felt like I was never going to measure up. And it was a very interesting experience because I was devastated. And I can still remember one night in November, I was just broken. And I prayed and knelt next to my bed, and I said, Heavenly Father, please take this away from me because I don't think I can do this. And I'm a strong woman. I didn't think I could do this. And I can't tell you, there's this wave of warmth that came over me that said, I am with you, and it will be okay. And that is a moment I've hung on to for now almost 20 years.
That's good. Thank you.
And what was very interesting to me was it was a very difficult time for us and our family, and we were approaching the holidays, and I didn't know how to deal with that. And so I flew home. The first Christmas we were separated, I flew home to be with my family, and my kids had gone with their dad to be with their cousins because that's what the original plan was, and I didn't want to disappoint them. And that was hard, but it was the first step in the journey of what I needed to do and how I needed to learn to take care of myself too. So that was our first step. So that was 2003, and I felt very alone. On top of this, I had just come off some significant medical challenges, which made me feel more unworthy. It made me feel like I wasn't in a situation where I could ever really recouple. I have Graves' disease, and at the time I was going through orbital radiation. I know this sounds kind of weird. I wasn't going to put these up, and then Keith said, you need to tell this story. This is part of who you were. I was very, my face was deformed, my vision was impaired. I used to have to put ointment on my eyes to keep them shut at night, and I went through orbital radiation at USF. So this is my last day of radiation treatments. I bring this up because on top of everything else I was dealing with my kids and trying to find my new normal, I was coming off some serious medical issues. And I kind of wondered, should I ever remarry? Like, is this okay that I am who I am and I'm going to bring this into a new relationship? I've healed, and my patriarchal blessing told me that I would be sick, and through my faith and the faith of those who blessed me, I'd return to my everyday life. So I knew I would be okay, but it was a challenge on top of what I was already going through. And I'm grateful for the challenge, but it was hard. And so that was where I was. And we have a lot in store to tell you about where we went. So Keith's turn next.
Yeah, so mine didn't come out of left field. My wife and I struggled, my ex-wife, and I struggled for about 2 years. There was hardly any contact, hardly any discussion. You know, I've been married for 19 years, and this conference has really brought the emotion up. Brother Day, Stephen Day this morning apologized because he was a crier. I am too. Margaret and I were involved in the addiction recovery program for the church for many, many years, working with the youth. And so we did a lot of research because we're kind of nerdy too, and so we got into the research, learned about brain development. And, you know, the brain doesn't, the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until our mid-20s. And children start out with mirror neurons. In other words, if you see, you know, you're looking at a parent, I don't know why I'm emotional about this. You're looking at a parent and, you know, the young child, because they're almost all the prefrontal cortex is almost all mirror neurons, they just mirror what they see. Well, I think as my brain developed, I never lost them. So if somebody's crying, I'm crying with them. In any event, this was a really rough time. I had 3 kids. I am a proponent of marriage. I can prove that by the fact that I've done it 3 times, okay? You can see my older daughter, okay? I didn't see her for 4 or 5 years. My first wife ran off and hid her for many years. So now you know why relocation and child relationships are important to me. And then I had 2 with my second wife. And as the wheels were coming off of that marriage, I knew that there was one common denominator to all of that, and that was me. So I spent a couple, I wish I could talk through tears. I know people who can, and I'm not one of them. I spent a couple of years in therapy, in counseling, just trying to figure out what is it about me that contributed to the mess. And yet I say that I have 3 beautiful kids, right? I couldn't see that at the time. In any event, so I'm in this, and I'm trying to figure out all the things that were part of my background. And you know, I love my parents. My dad was a workaholic, and my mom was pretty distant. She was an alcoholic. And so I had a lot of childhood trauma that I needed to get through. I still think of the therapy and the 7-year-old, and I think, wow, I've done pretty well. So if you're ever, particularly men just struggle with the thought of going to therapy. Man, go. It'll open up your life to new vistas. And here I am. So.
I guess I'm a vista.
Yes. Oh, she's beautiful. She's beautiful to look at. I mean, and to see how she moves other people to positive things. She's really an inspiration. In any event, I can say that because she worked with me. But that's for later in the story. So because we don't have all day long, I could literally talk all day long. I am paid by the word in my job, so, but not here, not here. But we knew that this was coming to an end, and so it finally did. And she was a lawyer. I kind of felt set up. She knew she had those relationships, and she had the relationship with the judge, and so I felt like I was just set up. But I do believe things happen for a reason. I was I took a job. I owned a construction company. I had a couple partners. I sold my interest to my partners, and I took a job. I was going to build U.S. embassies around the world for an outfit out of San Antonio. But then it turns out that couldn't quite happen on the time frame that the outfit had thought about, so they put me in a program building power plants, natural gas power plants. And I was grossly overpaid for the little bit of time I had to work. But that's exactly what I needed, because I was flying back every other weekend to see my kids. And so, I look back. I'm a firm believer that life is to be lived forward and understood backwards. I can see the hand of the Lord in my life now, but I sure couldn't see it then. I was in the midst of this disaster. And then things, because of the counseling, things started to cool down. I was able to get my feet underneath me. And then my brother, my twin brother, yeah, there's two of us, he was saying, you need to get back involved. You know, you need a new circle. You need to start dating. And I thought, oh man, that's the last thing I want. But he said, no, you really need to try this. So we're well, I think that's the next slide, isn't it? Yeah, we went to LDS Mingle. Whoops.
This car brought us together.
Yeah. So we're going to tell the story.
Because I thought he was a little too old to drive a red sports car.
Yeah.
So I pointed that out to him.
So anyway, I went on, and my brother said, hey, there's these two websites. One's LDS Singles, one LDS Mingle. Mind you, this is when internet dating was taboo. You don't do it. This is where all the crazies are, right? Well, maybe, because I was on it. But you know, it was an opportunity to engage. And I picked LDS Mingle because they had more questions, so I figured if there were more data points, then the matches would mean more. And so I'm trying to think of this analytically. And so I put up, not this picture, we couldn't find the one I put up, but I put up a picture of me and my little Miata. That was my midlife crisis. I was going to buy a BMW, but that's $20,000 more than this. And you know, they're set up very similarly, by the way, if you're interested in cars. And I went and put in some, the front tower struts and the back brace and the torsion bar. And then I took it out on the track. In fact, I had it for 2 weeks, and I had it out on Firebird Raceway in Phoenix, doing 105 miles an hour and getting into turns. I was enjoying life for a change, right? And so I was proud of that. And so I put that on my post. And I also said that I don't watch TV. Okay, I've never really been interested in TV for whatever reason. If it's a documentary that I'm going to learn from or sports, I can watch that. But these dramas and sitcoms, I just never got into them. Well, so I had this ethos that if someone reaches out to me, then they deserve a response. Okay, but there were...
It's pity, that's what he means.
Yeah, that's true. But there were two things that I did not want. I did not want to date another lawyer, and I did not want a long-distance relationship. So I get pinged by this law gal from Montana, and I'm in Las Vegas. So I responded. You know, she said something about, you know, it's glad to see that there's not another, or that someone out there isn't a couch potato or something like that. I actually kept the email exchange. I should have reviewed it. But then I thought, okay, she's going to get a response. She deserves that. So I thought, okay, yeah, I kind of said what I already said here. And then I thought, how do I tell her I'm not interested without hurting her? And so I thought, I'll use some legal language. And I was not a lawyer, by the way, not at that time. But I'll use some legal language, and I'll just insult where she lives. So I said, by the way, what compelling reason would anyone have to live in Montana in the wintertime? Thinking that she'd say, oh, he's a creep. I don't want to deal with him. Fine. That's fine with me. But instead, she writes this really compelling response about how beautiful, I don't know why I'm emotional, how beautiful the new fallen snow is in Montana. And I thought, wow, she can write. And then she says, and by the way, what's with the little red sports car? Did you never grow up? And I thought, fantastic. She can write and she can take and give a joke. I was intrigued. So I jump back on and we start writing. We never missed a day without responding to each other at this point. Okay, now you think that's something. Just wait. Okay? So, she's a lawyer, I'm a contractor. Okay, now she happened to be a guardian ad litem, meaning that she represented children. Her entire practice was at the intersection of children and divorce. I didn't know that. I wasn't really interested anyway, but I was interested in who I was talking to. But this is about, you know, this is number 3 for me. Heaven forbid I should go to 4, right? Now, I'm here to tell you the number doesn't make a difference because, in fact, the higher the number, the more someone's trying. So, for what that's worth. But this was going to be, this was serious. I was going to approach this seriously. So when we say merger and acquisition negotiation, we mean it. We decided that, Margaret was an author. She taught in the paralegal program up at University of Montana. We had a paralegal program that was just starting at UNLV. And I said, maybe you should come down and pitch your textbook down here. And she decided she would. And then we realized it was going to be spring break, March of...
Wait, you're skipping ahead, babe.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I need to let her tell her side of this story.
I want a
'cause this is
minute
the fun
on that.
part. Yeah, go ahead.
No, what happened was the first time we ever had communication, he said, can we talk on the phone? And I said, after 10 o'clock, because that's when my kids go to bed. And he called.
Oh, what else was going on at 10?
Another guy was calling too.
Yeah.
So he called at exactly 10 o'clock. Exactly. And I still remember the first time he said, this is Keith. I still remember. It gives me warm chills. That was the first time we ever talked on the phone. And we talked for a long time, and that was the day where you don't have unlimited minutes. And so we were like stressing about like how much is this costing because you have to pay for long distance. And Keith was very special because I had put my ex-husband through school, and I was determined I was not going to put another man through school. And so when I was going on LDS Mingle, I could do searches. So at first I thought, I want a guy with a PhD. Because I have my doctorate, I want a guy with a PhD, so I don't have to put anybody through school. Well, I did that search, and I just couldn't find a lot of good eligible guys. So I thought, I'll try a master's. So I did the same thing. Oh, there was a couple. So then I thought, well, okay, I'll lower my standards to go to a bachelor's.
Did you hear that? She lowered her standards, and she found me.
But and it was the best decision I ever made. So I wrote him, he wrote me, and we had a lot of quirkiness back and forth. I was like, with what's wrong with the red sports car, and he was on me, and so it was really fun back and forth. But one of the first questions he asked me when he got on, the first question, well, maybe it was the second, but he said, if this works, who moves? That's a really forward question, right? But the reality is we both were very much approaching this as a business deal. Because here's the thing, I didn't want anybody to take advantage of me because I was tired of guys going, oh, she's a lawyer, she'll support me. I don't want that. I just want to be that strong woman, right? And I want to be independent. And he wanted what he needed. He knew what he wanted. In fact, we're going to put up our email at the end, but I do have a list of 150 questions I've developed because I teach a class at the university near us on you should ask your partner these questions before you ever think about getting engaged. And one of the first things we did, we did date on LDS Mingle. And one of the first date we had, I flew to Las Vegas, and we met at the LDS Temple in Las Vegas. Because I had read a blog post that said if your first date is in the temple, then you're much more likely to have somebody who's truthful about what they've told you online if you're dating online. Now, that's not 100%, but that's pretty good. In fact, our first date was in the cafeteria of the temple. And I thought, what a cheapskate. Like, seriously? Dinner was $9.95. And I was like, you're so cheap. But you know what? Every year since we first met, we went back to the temple. Now they don't have the cafeterias anymore, but we ate at the same table. For 18 years, we did that. Well, 17 years.
17 years, yeah.
But that was just a wonderful experience. And our first date was in the temple, and I had goo-goo eyes, and it was crazy. And I was like, this guy is really kind of cute. And he's really nice, and he owns a house, and all the things that I wanted. And my kids will tell you this is so terrible. But one of my boys would said to him, you know, my mom just married you for your money. And he goes, I know, but I lost it all, so I know she still loves me. So, you know, it was a conversation about what I wanted. Do you have that list that they tell you in Young Men's and Young Women's? Write a list of what you want in a relationship. I wrote it. Because my friends told me, you've got 4 kids, you're going to have to compromise. And I thought, I am not compromising. And I didn't. And I got a wonderful man. But it was a little while.
So did you check the dates? Yeah. 10 weeks. What? 10 weeks from first contact to the day we were married. Now, I don't recommend that. But think about it. We did speak on the phone after that first phone call every single night for at least 2 hours, often 4. And it was all the negotiation. It was all hard questions because we didn't want to waste time on a relationship that wasn't going to work, particularly if we're going to try to do this long distance. So my first question was, if this works out, who moves? Her first question was, have you read the book Parenting with Love and Logic? Fortunately, I had. Okay, it's a great book. We live by it. In fact, I use it in my law practice today. It works. But most people don't approach relationships that way. It doesn't mean that you don't have to go through it. Okay, you have to get to the root questions. And so we did. We spent a great deal of time looking at, how are we going to do this? Especially, how are we going to blend our families? Now, we knew, this was taken just within months of our marriage, we knew, and my oldest daughter at this point was in high school, so she wasn't able to travel as much.
And can I say, this is the picture, this is why this is so special to us. Our daughter, when she went on her mission, our oldest daughter in this picture, when she went on her mission, she made a copy of this picture for all of her siblings and put it in a little frame and gave it to them because she didn't want them to forget her while she was on her mission. This is the picture that she used when she was 18 years old.
But we knew that our kids were small, and whatever decisions we made, whatever choices of direction and discipline and these sorts of things that we made, were going to affect them. Now, I don't want you to think it's all been, roses and champagne. Well, we don't drink champagne. Roses and whatever other pleasant things you can think of. It was work. Okay, it was difficult at times, particularly since you've got 2 type A personalities. Okay, but the idea that we both understood was we needed to blend. We needed to do everything we could to make sure that we had a solid relationship. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon your view, Margaret's kids were told by their father they couldn't call me Dad. And they came home distressed by that after a visit. And I said, you can call me anything you want. Just don't call me late for dinner, right? And so I was Keith to them. Today, they still call me Keith, but they tell me, you were more of a dad than our dad was. That makes me feel great. Okay.
I think that comes from a culmination of what Keith did, that you've been to your classes and you understand being negative about your co-parent is very likely to just backfire in the long run for your kids. And Keith did everything he could to support my kids' relationship with their dad. And I'll give you an example. When my daughter turned, she was about to go to her 8th grade graduation, and she realized that her dad's timeshare interrupted her 8th grade graduation. And he lived out of state, and she ran up the stairs. She was distraught. She just ran upstairs, and she went on her bed, and she cried. She was going to miss her 8th grade graduation. And Keith went up the stairs, and he patted her on the back, and he said, you know what, sweetie, you're going to have a lot more graduations, but you're not going to be able to get this time back with your dad. And she always remembered that moment. She remembered that we encouraged her to go see her dad. We encouraged all of our kids to see their dad and to have a back and forth. And that's something that really helped us form a strong bond with all of our kids.
But I also understood that from the perspective of one who was being totally alienated from his kids, from my kids, right? Because this is all of us save one. But I knew, because I was being portrayed as the evildoer, that that kind of, I call it alienation because that's what it is, and that's the term we use in my practice, and there's other forms, and I don't know what they are, but the point is that negativity, when you blame the other parent, all you're doing is hurting the kids, and their ability to have a full relationship with their other parent. And so I was not going to do to her children what was being done to mine. And so this was a great opportunity for us to kind of test what we had learned, right? What we had learned either through her practice and her research. Her background is sociology and family systems, and so she was an expert on her own anyway. I learned it through therapy and the School of Hard Knocks, but it worked. We end up now with a great relationship with our kids. And so if we do anything today, particularly given the average age of the participant here, we hope that we are instilling hope. Now, just a side note, I used to say for years that I was going to write a book about the tyranny of hope. Okay? Hope is an anchor, right? Not the anchor we saw earlier today that keeps you grounded, but the anchor that pulls you underwater and drowns you. Because I stayed in my relationship for 2 years when at the beginning of that 2 years, I knew it was not going to work. This was a pretty dark time when I was saying, hope is tyrannical. Now, I see the benefit of hope. So now I can, compare the two. I might still write the book, but I'm going to have another chapter in it about the beauty of hope. Okay, we want you to see the beautiful side of hope. We want you to walk away thinking, no matter how bad my situation might be today, there are things I can do to improve the outcome later. Okay?
And I think one of the things that we need to really point out is that we've had a ton of fun, and we've learned we have a family reunion every year, and we have a lot of good times, but it wasn't always like that. So let's kind of go through some of the mistakes and the lessons we've learned.
Can you see that? This is a cartoon Margaret found. Actually, I should just let you talk for a while.
No, this is a cartoon somebody gave me years ago because I've done training in this area for a very long time. And this is what we actually don't want. But I would venture that most of us in the room have had a moment where maybe we felt like this and we wanted to take a look. But the thing we understand and that I've learned in hindsight is divorce does not damage children. What damages children is your dislike, your hate, your frustration, the conflict that tends to be engendered when there's a very difficult divorce.
And I want to temper that statement a little bit, okay? Divorce does hurt children, okay, just like it hurts us. But life hurts children. We're supposed to be put through difficult times. So when we say divorce does not damage children, we don't mean it doesn't affect them. Obviously, it affects them. But it doesn't have to determine their outcomes if we set it up right.
Judith Wallerstein did a 25-year study of kids of divorce, and she found the number one factor in how kids did long-term was the level of conflict. And we're going to teach you that kids really need one foundational parent. So even if your other parent refuses to participate in a healthy, appropriate way, if one foundational parent can do that, that's the start. So we do want to, just a couple of things. Divorce does not damage children. It hurts them. But conflict damages children long term. We do encourage you to continue to engage in church because sometimes there are times where people get frustrated with church. And they may look at the way things, they were taught or something. And yet church offers hope. Church offers love. Church offers a support group. And if you're hurt by somebody at church, let them know. Don't just walk away. Because truly, we are all trying our best. We are. And we don't mean to do things intentionally or unintentionally to hurt others. Also, allow your youth leaders to help, especially when you have teenagers. There are some of our teenagers that are now adults that only made it because they had amazing youth leaders who came to the house when they were having trouble or would talk to them or take them under their wing. So President Nelson says
Oops, I didn't touch it.
I think it has a timer. Life is filled with detours and dead ends, trials and challenges of every kind. Each of us has likely had times when distress, anguish, and despair almost consumed us. Yet we are here to have joy? Yes. And he actually adds a resounding yes. We will get through it once you understand that the Lord has a plan for each one of us. And I know some people don't like that to be heard, but I feel like looking back, My challenges have made me a better person because I'm no longer scared to talk about my divorce. I'm no longer embarrassed by who I am because of where I was. I am who I am, and I hope because of that, I can share something that I've learned, just as you've been sharing with us through this conference.
You know, and I'll just add to that to say that, you know, I do believe that, you know, some say, well, it's not so much that there's a reason we go through all these things. There's not necessarily a design purpose for everything, and that's probably true. But I do believe that God is in the details. He knows us. He knows what we need. And sometimes he gives us stuff that we really don't want. But didn't his son face that? Okay. So if you've been to one of our other classes, you've seen this. And I just want to touch on it for a moment, because this is a really important point to understand. Many of you heard the explanation, but think to yourself, you don't have to blurt it out, but why did McDonald's make Happy Meals? Did they want to give a young child a good experience and they wanted to pay for it? No, there was a reason to it. They understood that if you connect something with a happy emotion, that child is going to want to return to it. This is how they built customers for life. If you remember that Super Size Me show that came out and said, if you eat at McDonald's, you're going to die, their numbers, their sales did not significantly reduce because they had known that they built these strong connections, happy McDonald's, and adults then, who grew up with that, were not going to just jettison this idea of McDonald's being a good place to eat because they loved going there. It almost didn't matter what the food was. Now, I kind of like McDonald's, she doesn't. It doesn't matter, we don't go there. But this is an important thing because it works in the negative as well. In our practice, we see different groups, different individuals recommending child exchanges on holidays. I can think of no better way to teach a child to hate a holiday than to do a custodial exchange on it. The study that Margaret was talking about, The Unexpected Legacy of Divorce by Judith Wallerstein, proved that children who stay at heightened levels of anxiety tend to develop all sorts of different behavior and emotional difficulties later in life. And we know from research from Dr. Dina Stacer that children have about a 72-hour window, okay, a day and a half before the exchange and a day and a half after, where they have a heightened state of anxiety because their life is going to change. Even, you know, Margaret and her ex got along great, relatively speaking, and their kids knew that, and they still felt anxious because their life was going to change at that moment, right? They went from one house and one set of routines to a different house and a different set of routines. How many of you get a little bit stressed when you travel and you're going to be staying in a hotel? And you get to control all that. Kids are completely out of control. They have no control over what's happening. And so if we do an exchange where we know that that anxiety is going to be heightened on the holiday, all we're doing is combining holiday and bad experience, and we end up with a McDonald's effect. So be aware of that as you're doing your planning.
And if either any of you need a holiday schedule or a parenting plan that's used pretty consistently, we have that I developed that for all the judges in the state of Nevada. So I'm happy to share that with you. It's based on a lot of research on how best to exchange kids, when to exchange them for holidays. So that's, well, we're happy to share that.
And I never liked President Lee's quote about failure in the home. I forget now how it is because I've tried to push that out of my mind, but nothing compensates for failure in the home, right? I like this one much better. Okay, this is what he was getting at. Okay, I honestly don't believe he was trying to castigate those of us that looked at divorce as a failure. I certainly did. But the most important work is that's done in your home. So keep sight of that. Okay?
One of the key things you need to remember is that some of you may have some of you have a very difficult partner. You have a difficult co-parent. They're usually angry or hurt because of a wound that they've had. Remember, anger doesn't come from a bad place. It comes from a sad place. It comes from hurt, sorrow, frustration, lack of control. But what we need to let you know is that your kids absolutely need one foundational parent. And for many years, I taught a program at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where people were court-ordered to come to my program, mom one day, dad the other day. And one of the most important concepts I taught them is kids need one parent that's reason-abled. So one reasonable parent. That's not going to throw all the dirt on them. That's not going to put them in the middle of the conflict. That's not going to ask them what happened at mom's house. But that's going to allow them to have a safe and appropriate place where they can be loved and supported. And I hope that's you. By coming to this conference, it suggests to me that you are. So here's what I'm just going to ask you to do. We don't have, we teach a whole series at Education Week on step parenting and parenting. But one thing that you need to start today, from now on, no longer say anything negative about your co-parent. You can say, well, I don't agree with that. If dad said that you're selfish, I don't agree with that. Thanks for sharing. But now, from now on, you're going to say one nice thing to your child about your other parent. Now, some of you are going to have a really hard time with this. And this is what I had to start with. I like mustard on my hot dogs, too. That's what I got to start with at the very beginning. That's all I could find. But it was something. Because the second you allow your children to have an open, honest conversation with you without sending an email to your co-parent about what your kids just reported has happened in their house, but you just let them talk, they will start opening up, and they'll share their hurts with you. They'll talk to you about what's going on, but you got to get out of that tit for tat of I'm going to say negative things because you're saying negative things. So along those lines, a lot of people have a very difficult idea thinking their child may one day be a stepchild, either through their recoupling or through their partner's recoupling. So we want to spend a few minutes to ask you this important question. Who's the most famous stepchild who ever lived? And who's the most famous stepfather who ever lived? They did it. It's a different dynamic, of course, so we're going to share some mistakes that we've made. And we're going to try to be quick about it because we know we don't have a ton of time, but this is what we look like today. We're going to go back to that because that's what we're talking about. Some mistakes we reflect on. Let me just give you a couple of mistakes we reflect on. Number one is when you recouple, if you recouple, don't always side with your kids. It's very natural to defend your kids all the time if you decide to recouple. It's really easy to just defend your kids, to always say, my kid's right. And to protect your kids from your new spouse. And I'll give you the perfect example. We are readers in my family. I love reading. Keith loves reading. We all love reading. My kids, I used to have a rule that I'm a good mother till 8 o'clock at night. I just want you to know, after 8, I was not a good mom.
She would tell the kids this.
They knew it. So by 8 o'clock, they had to be in their rooms, door closed, no digital electronics in their room at all. They could read a book, they could do homework, but 8 o'clock was my breaking point. And they to this day will say, my mom's a good mom till 8 o'clock. That's true. And so my son would like to stay up really late and read, and sometimes he would wake up late. And so Keith said, okay, listen, by 9 o'clock, lights have to go out so everyone gets up on time for school. Well, my son was already having a difficult time with the transition. So I was like, he should be able to read as late as he wants. So I said, listen, just put a towel under the door and he'll never see the light. Keith will never know you're reading the book. I know. Isn't that terrible? But that's an example of how I used to do what I wanted to do and undermined Keith. That's not right, and that's not healthy. So I'm telling you, that was a mistake, but I'm just admitting.
But I'm going to go a little further than that.
Oh, my.
Yeah. Because her 4 kids, and eventually her second son, we all decided, because he was just not doing well with the transition, that he would go live with his dad. So about halfway through, he went to live with his dad, and it turned out great. But Margaret and I, this was work. This was work. Blended families have all sorts of struggles. that traditional unified biological families don't, and it comes from a good place. It comes from the place of, particularly mothers tend to be more nurturing, tend to be more protective, tend to be less, oh, get up, you're okay, so you're bleeding a little bit. That's not hers, that's mine, right? That's what the fathers typically do, but mothers, oh, they pick them up, oh, you poor thing, right? So what happens when I've witnessed something that I don't like, and even though we've both read all the parenting books that we've both read and all that, she doesn't agree with how I'm going to do it. All of a sudden, now she's protecting them from me. Nothing undermined our relationship deeper or faster than that. In the few times that I don't want to say we consider divorce, we never have, but the few times that came to my mind was that situation.
And there were things like, oh, they're just a few minutes late for curfew. It's no big deal. Oh, I know they didn't get all their chores done. That's not a big deal. Well, I know they told a white lie, but they were just trying to protect their sister. So they weren't anything major, but Keith was very black and white about stuff. There was a consequence. And I was like, gray. We tend to be gray. He told me to move. We tend to be gray as parents, the natural parents, because we're always protecting our kids. So those were some mistakes we made, and we had unrealistic expectations. We thought, we're going to get married and it's going to be perfect. It was work. But there are some positive things we did too. We created a unified family culture. We decided together, out of the presence of the kids, what the rules were going to be. We presented the rules to the kids. We had regular family dinner and activities, and they weren't allowed to have their digital devices at the table. Once they became teenagers, if they brought their digital devices to the table, I would say, no problem, sweetheart. I will hold it for you for 24 hours, and I'll respond to all your friends' texts for you, and I'll help you out in the communication realm while I'm holding your phone hostage.
But I also want to add to that, it was important that I not usurp her authority, because the reality is the children didn't see me the same way that they saw her. And so I was trying to take that. I was trying to take more than I really should have. And as she eased on protecting them from me, I eased on being sure that my, I don't want to say punishments, but my consequences were the ones that they followed. I needed to let her do the hard lifting there and then support her.
And
so it was a two-way street.
And then with his kids, he would be the one to make
Right.
the rules. And we decided we were going to parent together as a unison. Now this is interesting because my co-parent, my kid's dad, they had a strict rule in their house. He only disciplined his kids and she only disciplined her kids. And as my kids got older, they said they hated that. Originally they liked it. But as they got older, they were like, that sucked because we were never a family unit. And we were. We established family traditions. We have Pickard pancakes on Saturday. Keith makes amazing buttermilk pancakes on Saturday. We had our own Christmas traditions that we created. We asked the kids what they loved and what we should continue. And we started some new ones. We always had family prayer and scripture study, and we'd get on the couch at 8:30 and we'd lay on top of each other and we'd try desperately to get through a chapter, with each person reading one verse. So we had a lot of traditions. We started things. So we did do things right, but there were lots of bumps.
Although I will say that when it comes to the scripture reading, I was more about you read, because we would rotate through, and so when Bailey would ask a question, I'd say, later, right? Well, she came back to me, I think it was just before her mission, and she said, I want you to know that really bothered me. And I realized that, I needed to be more flexible. Now that we have Come Follow Me, we've all learned that, but I didn't really. So, we're tripping over ourselves sometimes, but the one thing that all the kids knew was that we were trying.
And so we would read scriptures at 8:30, and each person read one verse, and Keith wanted to keep on the schedule, one verse. And sometimes the kids would want to stop and ask questions, and I'd be like, let's have that conversation. And that was a hard adjustment for us. And we're working on it. We're still working on things. Our daughter still points out that Keith would never allow her to play. This is what she talked about last week, and she's grown, married, and has a baby. That Keith wouldn't let her play in what she called the sandbox in the backyard. Keith's like, it was my sand trap for my golf putting green.
I had built,
it was a sandbox, Keith.
I had built a little pitching area, false grass and little sand trap, and I didn't want that all over the place.
How stupid. It was a
How
sandbox.
stupid is that?
All right, so you can see we had some differences. All right, so here's what we do. We play lots of games. I was very, very poor as a single mother, so we do lots of inexpensive things. We play games together. We do picnics together. We get out. We do fun times. And a lot of these pictures are people who just, they're our kids' friends. They came in, they came out. Our family was very fluid. This is our family reunion we have every year. We always play tons of games. We do fun things together to spend time together. Somebody gave me some very important advice one time, my friend's grandfather. Have a family reunion every single year. Even if it's only a long weekend, have a family reunion where you get together. Because we don't have 500 cousins each, like many of you probably do. It's just our kids and us, really. And then I've got a small family, and he's got a small family. But time together is invaluable. Put the digital devices away. In fact, you don't see it here, but at our family reunion, all of our son-in-laws and our sons know no video games. But we do kind of have an unwritten rule. After 9 o'clock, they can sneak into the boiler room, and they can all play together, and they do. And I have a picture of that. It's fun. So we try our best, but here's what we want to let you know. We want to let you know that ultimately the joy we feel has little to do with the circumstances of our lives and everything to do with the focus of our lives. The fact that you are at this conference these last 2 days tells me your focus is to have healthy, happy, productive lives for yourself and your children, because you're learning how to do that step by step. So we just want you to remember your kids' lives and your lives are now going to expand. You're going to have more people who are going to love you. You're going to have more people that are going to love your kids. Allow that to happen. Welcome those times in. And one day you're going to be sitting with somebody who's going through great hurt and times of trials, and you're going to share the lessons you've learned. So thank you for coming to this conference this week. Thank you for joining us tonight. We didn't put our email up. What email do you want them to use? You can use Nevada, Nevada, Nevada Mediator, Mediator, Nevada Mediator at gmail.com, Nevada Mediator at gmail.com. We're not selling anything. We have some things that could be helpful for you if you want to see what the holiday schedule, a really good standard holiday schedule for every type of separation or divorce looks like. We can send you an article if your co-parent is alienating your kids from you, what parental alienation is and how to respond to it. And that's the third thing, perfect. And the 150 questions, I call it 101 questions because it sounds better, but it's 150 questions you should ask your partner if you're considering becoming engaged or getting married. So, or any questions you might have in general, we're happy to answer them. So we're here for you. We're grateful for all of you joining us. We're going to be here for a few minutes to answer questions, but we do want to say that we're happy. Somebody said to us earlier, you guys seem really happy. I'm like, we're happy. But there was a lot of hard times. And we're glad we are where we are. And thank you so much for joining us today. We say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.